Konnichiwa, it's Justin Morris here with another Diabetes Insight vlog. Now, I've lived with type 1 diabetes for many years now, and type 1 diabetes is always challenging, no matter where we are. But in some parts of the world, how we manage those challenges can be very different. I've been lucky to spend a lot of time in a lot of different countries over the years, and today I wanted to chat a bit about the differences between how we manage type 1 diabetes in Australia and how I've noticed type 1 diabetes is managed in Japan. Our food, our diet is of course a big part of how we manage our type 1 diabetes. In Australia, our diet and the food we have access to tends to be very rich in carbohydrates, which means I have to take the insulin to factor in those carbohydrates. In Japan, I've noticed there's a lot more of a balance between the protein, which is in foods like the fish that you eat, and also the carbohydrates, like the rice. I've also noticed in Japan, there is more deliberate purpose behind eating meals. It's a meal-oriented structure when it comes to eating. You have a very good breakfast, a very good lunch, and a very good dinner. In Australia, the culture around food is a bit more of a snacking culture. We tend to eat on a more regular basis throughout the day. But this leads into probably one of the biggest things I've noticed when it comes to food between Australia and Japan. In Australia, people eat anywhere at any time. And it is not uncommon to see people eating on the bus, on the train, in the aeroplane, walking and eating food, or even riding the bike and eating food. In Japan, I've noticed there is not so much eating in public, and eating is more of a thing done in a purposeful event with family or friends, in a restaurant, a cafe, or at home. This can dictate how you might treat things like hypoglycemia between Australia and Japan. Access to healthcare is of course a big part of managing our type 1 diabetes and our understanding of what opportunities we might have despite our type 1 diabetes. We are very lucky in Australia and also very lucky in Japan that we live in countries that have a public healthcare system. I've lived in other countries where this is not the case, and it makes the burden of living with type 1 diabetes far greater, and that inhibits the understanding of what we might be able to achieve in life despite our diabetes. I'm very grateful to have grown up in Australia, which means I always have access to insulin, I always have access to blood glucose monitoring that I need to manage my type 1 diabetes. This, I understand, is also the case in Japan, that there is a public healthcare system that supports the access to insulin and the things you need to manage your diabetes. Now, of course, this can always be better in both of our countries. And the one thing that is common both in Australia and Japan that really helps us in managing our type 1 diabetes and encouraging the access to the things we need, and that is community organisations. We have a community organisation called the JDRF in Australia. This organisation lobbies the government so we have more access to resources to help us manage our diabetes. In Japan, I have attended many of the summer camps for children with type 1 diabetes. At these events, we learn about our diabetes, we meet other people with diabetes, which really enhances our opportunities in life and enhances our understanding of how best to manage our type 1 diabetes. That's the biggest thing I think we can be so grateful for in both of our countries when it comes to our diabetes management, and that is our community organisations that support us with type 1 diabetes. The biggest difference that I've noticed of experiencing type 1 diabetes between Australia and Japan lies, I believe, in the differences of the social and cultural norms between our two countries. Australia is a very open country where differences between individuals are probably encouraged. There's not so much of a negative side to living with type 1 diabetes as far as letting people know that you live with the condition. The stories about people who live with type 1 diabetes are quite well publicised, and the condition itself is quite mainstream and well known throughout our society. In Japan, I have noticed that this is not so much the case. Often people with type 1 diabetes are not so confident in telling people that they have this condition, and also maybe scared about admitting to friends, to workplaces, to colleagues, to other sporting teams and other organisations that they live with type 1 diabetes. This stems into another aspect of living with this condition, and that is the need to treat our diabetes. In Australia, if you see someone with type 1 diabetes, often they would not think twice about needing to test blood sugar or take an injection in any setting, whether it's public or in private. In Japan, I've noticed people are a lot more apprehensive about taking an injection or a blood sugar test in public, and this tends to be more of a private experience. This, I think, is something that can really help us with our management and our experience of living with type 1 diabetes, is being comfortable and confident to express our condition, express our feelings about our condition to whoever we may encounter in our life. It's something I hope we can work on, continue to work on in Japan, to make people feel less different because they live with this condition. The reality is we have great support in both Japan and Australia for living with type 1 diabetes. And like I said, the community groups are the biggest core of this support. So if you live in Japan, I hope you're able to come down here and visit us in Australia one day. And if you're in Australia, I hope you can visit Japan one day. They're both amazing countries. And both of these countries, they mean that living with type 1 diabetes, yes, of course, it's a challenge for us, but it's not a barrier.